Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Critical Eye. The world is a small place. We are told we live in a global village, and it's often true. When you look at the internet, you can reach pretty much any part of the world. Go to Google and you can actually visually see any part of the world. It's a reality that the world has become a very, very small place for many of us. But is that a good thing in all aspects? Well, certainly when it comes to armed conflict, wars, and other such events, it seems that this global village is becoming actually ever more interactive. Whatever happens in the Middle East, for instance, and we've been seeing much turmoil in the Middle East over the last 3 to 4 decades, but it seems to be ever increasing, is having also an impact on us here in the West, undoubtedly. Without a doubt, immigration issues would not exist without conflicts and wars that are being perpetuated often by Western superpowers in the Middle East. Arguably, the entire migrant crisis that's hitting Europe right now is largely the result of wars instigated by NATO and various other forces that have their economic interests, as they say, whether it's through oil or minerals or other smuggling and illicit, if you like, trade as well. These are all possibilities, and they all certainly seem to have evidence that suggests we should take them far more seriously. Within the studio today, I have Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos. Welcome.
It's a pleasure to be here.
And also, of course, Imran Shah. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Imran, of course, is part of MPAC campaign group, and Marcus runs Politics First and an advocate for a lot of justice, if you like, campaigns in Parliament itself, lobbying parliamentarians and such like to do the right thing. So this notion of blowback, Marcus, nothing comes without a consequence, but the Western powers have been unloading military hardware and firepower into the Middle East for a very long time. What signs of blowback have you been seeing, and what do you? Well, let's start with what you've actually can tell us about what you've actually witnessed already.
Well, first of all, as a result of British foreign policy concerning Libya, concerning Iraq, and concerning Syria, we can say most confidently, most persuasively, that the immigration crisis, which has engulfed Europe, certainly large parts of Europe, stems in large measure from Britain having destabilized both Libya, or helped to have destabilized both Libya and Syria. So if we go back to, let's say, the beginning of 2011, there was no immigration crisis engulfing Europe. There wasn't a mass of immigrants or refugees entering Europe from Libya. Why? Because at the beginning of 2011, Libya under Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, whether you liked him or not is irrelevant. He was the legitimate leader of Libya, but under him, Libya was a very stable country. Let's turn to Syria. At the beginning of 2011, before the Western instigated conflict in this country, there was no immigrants, there was no refugees engulfing Europe from Syria. Why? Because, like Libya, Syria was a very stable country, and indeed, Syria at the beginning of 2011 had one of the lowest crime rates anywhere in the world. A woman traveling on her own from Damascus to Aleppo would be able to make a return journey almost 100% guaranteed without the fear of crime. Now, because of British involvement in Libya and in Syria, by which I mean supporting Wahhabist terrorist groups, specifically I refer to Al-Qaeda and ISIS, we now have a very serious problem in the form of a refugee crisis. Now, that is because of Britain's actions. Secondly, as a result of Britain having worked together with terrorist groups in Libya and Syria, the terrorist threat, the extremist threat facing not just the Middle East, not just North Africa, not just Europe, but the entire world, has become all the more potent. We have to remember that despite the proclamations of British politicians and British mainstream journalists, the British state has had a long history of having had a strategic relationship with Wahhabism. What the relationship that Britain has with Wahhabism was born in Afghanistan in the 1980s, when the British were helping the Mujahideen to fight the Russians. That relationship then involved Bosnia, where the British played a role in bringing Wahhabist terrorists to Bosnia to fight against the Bosnian Serbs. Then that relationship extended to Libya. Then that relationship extended catastrophically to Syria. So there is a very potent threat in the region of the Middle East and in the wider world from terrorism, from extremism in the name of Wahhabism. But that threat would not be anything like how potent it is today without British support. The British use Wahhabist terrorists, like the Americans do, to try and achieve geostrategic objectives. And that is something that the ordinary person in Britain must be aware of. Yes, there is a very potent Wahhabist threat in the UK today. But why is that? It is because of the British state. The British state supported in the form of weapons, in the form of training, in the form of money, in the form of logistics. They provided that support to both ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Syria, and that is why Britain is facing a very potent threat, or I should be more specific. The British elite aren't exposed to that terrorist threat. It is ordinary British people when they use transportation in towns and cities across the UK.
Imran, the blowback isn't just on wider society. It's been quite specifically on the Muslim world. Arguably, a lot of these terrorist attacks emanating from, as Marcus argues, the backing of Western military, if you like, shenanigans and power, military power in those regions, often results in, it's resulted in millions of Muslim deaths for a start, compared to, if you like, the deaths we often hear far more about in the West. It's also actually effectively given the establishment in the West an opportunity to stigmatize the vast majority of Muslims that live in the Western shores as being essentially potential terrorists, certainly possible extremists, and whole policies have been rolled out against this. You've been a strong advocate against these wars of terror rather than what many people have been sold, the idea of a wars on terror. How do you, if you like, define and disentangle this notion of war of terror and war on terror?
So there's a clear link between a nation-state's foreign policy, especially if it's imperialistic, and the racism that happens in that country. So, the war on terror and the Islamophobia that we have present here in the UK and generally in the West, they are part of the same problem. And the problem of trying to deal with Islamophobia in a silo without the wider geopolitical context is that you are essentially just treating the symptom but not the actual cause. And so, and there's obvious sort of like mirrors of that and echoes of that in history. Like when the US was at war with Japan, they had concentration camps for Japanese. When during the transatlantic slave trade, that whole discrimination that we now coin as racism, that whole demonization of anybody, especially people of black skin, was geared towards because it was beneficial, economically beneficial to do so. And so you have this across the board, but the West is not alone in that, you've had other countries do that as well. And proxy terrorism, especially in Africa, they say the Cold War was actually like no one went to war, but it was red hot in Africa. So you had both the West as well as the East funding proxy terrorism, especially when certain African nations essentially rose to power, as well as you had essentially in something that's really particularly precious to us is that actually led to the Bosnian genocide. You had Russians supporting and arming the Serbs that led to that genocide. So there is a precedent for when a nation, especially a superpower, pushes for a particular geopolitical cause. There is always a danger of the indigenous people that are the victims abroad, but are also being victims in their home country as well. So that is just simply a systematic sort of real politics sort of reality of our world, and it's not abnormal to the West. It's something that's happened throughout history when it comes to superpowers. The Romans did it, the Mongolians did it, the Chinese do it, and still are doing it. It's just something that we always have to tackle.
So, Marcus, you talked about the blowback that comes to the West in terms of the immigration. That's one thing. We've cleared up also that the actual military actions also have a kickback because, of course, soldiers come back with all sorts of mental health problems. I mean, I've came across the statistics where it's said, I think 2,000 American soldiers a year may well be committing suicide. I mean, that's a shocking statistic. These are soldiers who've gone out to these wars in the Middle East, totally unprepared, and then left basically to rot when they've come back to their home countries. So the damage is not just one of immigration or sort of race relations, or if you like, physical, material, if you like, damage. It seems that there's a psychological and a mental cost and price to pay as well.
Yes, I'd agree, but I'd like to make 2 points very, very quickly. I don't believe the West, be it the British establishment or the American establishment, is anti-Muslim per se. No, I don't think there's any persuasive evidence to support that notion. I believe that the Americans and the British will work with any groups in the world, no matter how repugnant they are, providing those groups are a means to an end, providing those groups are willing tools of the Americans and the British, so that Washington and London can try and achieve geostrategic objectives. The second point I'd like to very quickly make is that there was no genocide in Bosnia. That was a creation of the West. The West in the 1990s saw itself as having achieved global dominance because the Soviet Union had been dissolved, and therefore in order for the Americans and the British to start intervening in geostrategic countries around the world, they needed a foundation, and that foundation had to be built on the policy of so-called humanitarian invention. And anyone who is familiar with the former Yugoslavia, anyone who's familiar with Bosnia will tell you that what happened at Srebrenica in July 1995 was a war crime, and they will tell you that what happened in Srebrenica began in the summer of 1992 onwards. So we have to be very careful about falling for the propaganda of the West, because 46,000 Bosnian Muslim women, children and young boys were allowed to leave. That's not genocide. Genocide is when you wipe out an entire group of people, regardless of their gender. Now, turning to British and American soldiers who have returned from countries such as Afghanistan and Iraq, suffering from post-traumatic disorders. That is another example of how the British state and the American state care nothing for the lives of British and American soldiers. To the British elite and to the American elite, those soldiers are merely pawns. They are merely a means to an end. Of course, in public, they have to say that we are putting money aside to look after our veterans from Afghanistan and Iraq. They have to say that. They have to be seen as doing something. That is for public consumption. The reality, of course, is suicide rates amongst returning British soldiers and returning American soldiers. We also have to look at how many of them develop mental health disorders, and indeed serious mental health disorders. How many also returning American and British soldiers turn to crime, turn to drugs, and turn to alcoholism. So that is just a reminder of how utterly indifferent the British and American establishments are, even to their own soldiers. They care only for their own interests. And remember, the American state is not America, and the British state is not Britain. We must not think that the two are the same. They are not. When the British and the Americans go into Iraq, or when they go into Kosovo, or when they go into Libya, or when they go into Syria, they are not going there out of the interests of the British people or the American people. No, they are going to those countries, to those victims, in the interests of the ruling elites in Britain and in America.
So, in conclusion, this idea of blowback, on the one hand, it seems as though the ordinary public suffers mental health disorders for soldiers that are returning, families that are obviously stricken as well as a result. We have the immigration or the migrants issue, which is another potential blowback, another pressure on the economies of Europe, one could argue. And at the same time, of course, we have fear of the other Muslims or people from the Middle East, by and large seen as terrorists or potential extremists by mainstream Britain, thereby exacerbating racial issues or racial tensions within Europe itself. All of these things have led to the rise of the right wing and a lot of populist movements that back nationalists as well, which is all part of some of the kind of, if you like, blowback. But there are benefits. It seems that the arms industry won't be complaining about these wars. Certainly all of the arms dealers will be making a lot of money at the increasing conflicts. I shouldn't imagine the elitists and the moneylenders who loan monies for those arms are complaining terribly, because they'll be making money out of those wars. It doesn't affect, I guess, the structural elite itself, because no matter which side wins, they will end up going and getting the construction deals for rebuilding those nations, presumably whichever side happens to end up winning. It seems that the only losers are potentially the ordinary folk and the people themselves. Marcus, your conclusions on today's issue of blowback, especially from a Western public's perspective?
I urge British people, and indeed ordinary people around the world, to learn the true nature of British foreign policy and of American foreign policy. And you can only do that by carrying out extensive research into the countries that Britain and America have either invaded or have bombed or who have sent their proxies to. Also, people around the world must stop relying on Western mainstream media. Stop reading British national newspapers. Stop reading American national newspapers. Stop listening to Fox News, CNN, BBC News and Channel 4 News, because those media outlets are neither independent nor free. They are part of the American and British establishments respectively, and they are potent weapons. They are some of the most powerful weapons that the West has in its arsenal. The West has an array of weapons, including economic sanctions, including bombs, but Western media, in my opinion, in my humble opinion, is the most potent. So I urge ordinary people around the world to listen to channels such as Ahlebait TV and others who are exposing the criminal, reckless and murderous nature of British and American foreign policy.
Imran, your conclusive remarks, final thoughts, please.
Yeah, I mean, blowback in itself comes from the idea that it comes from the reality that war is destructive. It's destructive to the economy. It's destructive to the human psychology. It's corrosive for our civil liberties. And it's even very corrosive when it comes to truth. So regardless of ideology, or regardless of what perspective you come from, if there's war efforts, if there's supporting of proxy militias or everything else, the first casualty is always the truth, and everything after that. So yes, there must be an emphasis to educate oneself on all different perspectives, to understand the angles in which different perspectives will come from. Some outlets will tell the truth on certain issues, and some will not, and vice versa. So then there needs to be definitely a learning across the board. But first and foremost, wherever there is war, the only way in which you can solve that war is through dialogue. Otherwise, you're going to get destabilization as well as blowback. And when you've seen essentially Western wars in the last century or so, that's exactly what you've seen, the destabilization of Iraq and so on. You've seen blowback because the human psychology can only take so much violence before they essentially go insane. And when you talk about quote-unquote radicalization, that's what's happening. So the root cause of all of this is foreign policy, especially from the West, and that is something that we essentially need to adhere to as a moment of common sense and move forward from there.
I think if there's one thing that we can learn perhaps over the last 30, 40 years is that war never actually causes immediate peace. It seems to actually cause far more chaos. Take Libya, take Syria, take Afghanistan, you take Iraq, traumatized nations where we were told that wars would solve the problem. It seems they don't solve the problems, they just add to them, and they actually leave behind destruction. The only winners seem to be the arms companies and the corporate elites. It really is our duty, I think, moral duty as citizens, to make sure that we hold our leaders to account and ensure that these wars that are continuing are stopped, and on top of that, those that are being planned are circumvented. It's really not acceptable. I think quite clearly all the statistics show the Americans have been responsible now for 20 million deaths plus since 1945. This is a liberal democratic nation which claims that it's going to bring peace and harmony to the world. Well, 20 million people plus the hundreds of millions who've suffered as a result through injuries and trauma and poverty, etc., that could run actually even into the billions. Who is going to compensate them? Certainly not the United States, certainly not the industrial military arms complex. Ultimately, it's on our conscience, especially those of us in the West who license these so-called democratic governments to fight these illegal wars for our own greed. Essentially, it's ultimately down to our moral conscience to stop those. Thank you to my guests, Marcus and also Imran, for joining me on this show. Until the next edition of Critical Eye,